मैंने वही किया था आई
Holy cover. Oh, that's there. That's not. The holy cover for everything wrong with transfer.
I had a brush and stuff. This is all being recorded.
ये बाद में बात करेंगे.
Okay, so we'll avoid.
मैंने 2-3 चीजों के रट्टे मारे हैं, मैं भूल जाएंगे.
How about it? Will you be telling us we can cut it out of like the events we're having? All the
That's just an argument.
that always comments they would
Basic
like.
It's actually basic.
Sorry guys, before we begin, a couple of rules. Can you shut the fuck up and compare with what happened in the last few days?
Sure.
You guys are speaking way too loudly. It's getting really annoying. It's hard to hear what. Also, unlike the last few debates, like just to be aware, at 7 minutes, at 7, we'll give you a guide, and we'll kind of stop like this. And at 7:15, so you can finish the sentence, you can finish the thought, you can say a few concluding remarks that you know which should be written, but we're not going to write anything else. And at 7:30, we're going to okay? And everyone is exactly the same time. Right, so yeah, so without any further ado, I call upon Prime Minister, that was magic, right?
Right honorable lady, naval document.
This debate is taking place in a context where the most immediate and pressing concern is to fight ISIS and the best way we can defeat them. Understanding that this debate is taking place in a very specific context where not only is the ISIS a threat to Syria, but also a threat to the stability of the region, and moreover, a threat to the stability of the Western region via the refugee crisis. We think that we will be arguing this debate on 3 grounds. Firstly, why is it morally legitimate to support Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria? Secondly, why is he the best option that the Western governments have of fighting against ISIS? And thirdly, why is it better for the Syrian people themselves if we go with him? Before I move on to that, and before let's look at the context within this debate, what is happening in Syria currently. First of all, there are a lot of different factions that are fighting within Syria, right? So at one end you have the Western governments that are carrying out airstrikes. At the same time, you also have independent bodies like the Free Syrian Army, Al-Nusra Front, the Iraqi forces, the Kurdish forces, etc., who are fighting with their own particular agendas within the region. Then at the same time, you also have Bashar al-Assad, who's trying to maintain some form of control, take back control from opposition forces as well as from ISIS, and he's being supported by Russia within Syria, right? And we have to understand that amidst all of this conflict, Syria is being completely destroyed in terms in terms of the infrastructure. It is becoming more and more inhabitable for the people of Syria, which is leading to a refugee crisis within the Western world. Having understood that, let's realize realizing that inaction is not a possibility, and there's some choice that needs to be made. And specifically that truce attempts are not possible because they keep getting broken by opposition or by ISIS itself. Let's understand this is a morally legitimate stance for the government to take because state policy has to be flexible, contextual, and sensitive to international development and cannot ever be based on moral absolutes. For example, USA, even though they had a lot of animosity with Iran and the kind of ideology that they represent, signed a nuclear deal with them, understanding that this has to be relative in terms of or based on real politics, right? Having understood that,
Ma'am,
go ahead.
the nuclear deal was signed after forcing Iran to give up its nuclear program. When he forced Assad to give up chemical weapons, he used biological weapons. This man is beyond accountability. Supporting him is worse.
Sure, but the thing is that because he needs support to win this war, he's going to be much more likely to negotiate terms with you and understand that he has to do. There are certain limits to what you expect him to not be able to do, etc. That's something I'll talk more about later in the case. But let's understand that foreign forces, such as the Western governments, don't have the luxury of time to first get familiar with the area that they are fighting under, and so sort of develop links in the same way that Bashar al-Assad already has, right? So he has an automatic advantage then over them. Secondly, there is no coherence in the way and in the strategies that different Western governments are following at this point. So Britain wants to do something else, USA wants to do something else, and there is no collaboration or proper attack that is being carried out against ISIS. And we think that Bashar al-Assad supporting him is the easiest and most productive way to equip and help a local body to deal with ISIS, right? We think that this is someone that you should sort of, he's the best person to fight against ISIS for a number of reasons. First of all, he is recognizable internationally by a majority of international actors that are involved. Secondly, he's a predictable actor, and you know what he will or will not do in different situations. A lot more than you may recognize the Free Syrian Army. Please sit down. We cannot have a recreation of the Afghanistan situation where you bring in a new body that turns out to be even more horrible than the one that was in power before. Please sit down, sir. He's someone who has shown possibility of reform in the past, right? So, for example, in the case of the Damascus Spring, where he let go of hundreds of political prisoners, or in 2011, where he dismissed his cabinet of loyalists who were against reform and lifted emergency law from within the country. So this is someone who will be malleable to negotiating with you because he needs your support to fight effectively and win against ISIS. Moving on, we think that we cannot support other bodies, for example, like the Al-Nusra Front, which the UN, because the UN categorizes them as terrorists, and he's the best person for stabilizing the region not only in terms of ending the war, but also what comes post-war, because of the fact that he has a lot of experience in government. He understands how to establish sort of the structures that existed within that society and has a much more experience with them than other people. Furthermore, opposition forces within Syria, such as the Free Syrian Army, etc., are struggling militarily right now. So, for example, the Syrian forces, which is Bashar al-Assad, was able to successfully carry on an assault and take back Aleppo from them. At the same time, he was also successfully able to take back regions from ISIS, and that was without the support of all of the Western governments that are fighting there, right? And we think that he can do a much better job when he has that support. Another reason for why we should support him, please sit down, is that right now, Russia is one of the very few bodies that actually provides him support in fighting against ISIS. And then you have countries like Iran who also support his government within that region. Supporting Bashar al-Assad is one of the only ways the entire international community can actually come together and form a coherent sort of policy on how they're going to go about ISIS and be united in that, right? Not only in terms of fighting the war against terror, but also in the post-war reform that you want to implement within Syria. And this way, Western governments can actually have a more active say in what happens to Syria after Bashar al-Assad has been defeated. Please sit down, sir. Lastly, we think that this is something that is going to be better for the Syrian people. We understand why there might be some concerns about accountability, etc., of what Bashar al-Assad has done in the past, but we think that you can still hold him accountable for those actions by at the same time supporting him for this government. We think that not only is he a familiar figure for the Syrian people, but a lot of them supported him when he was in government, right? And he represents stability and familiarity for them at a time where their livelihoods, their entire way of life has completely been lost to the kind of destruction that Syria has been subjected to. Today we've shown to you a number of things at Opening Government. We've shown to you that whatever policy that we come up with in dealing with ISIS has to be specific to the context of fighting ISIS, because that concerns overrides all other concerns at this point in time. We've shown to you that this is a choice that is morally legitimate, that he's the best person to fight against ISIS, and that Syrians are much more likely to accept him because he's familiar as opposed to bodies that we have no experience dealing with in the past. And he has more international legitimacy than any other actor working within Syria right now. Vote for him.
I thank you all for the speech. I'm still in favor
Assad.
of defense.
Very good.
What we decided to do as an international community regarding Syria is not only isolated towards the conflict right here, because we made that mistake in the past. We made it in 2003 in Iraq, where our only goal was to eradicate Saddam Hussein, and we never foresaw what would happen in Iraq. We made this very same mistake in 1980 when we decided to support Saddam Hussein against the Iranians. And what we saw over there, we saw, well, oh, Saddam would negotiate according to the logic. Oh, Saddam will become much better if we support him. But what happened? He became more belligerent. Why? Because of that undue power that we decided to give to him. So what it was criminal of team government today to not even talk about the aspiration of the Syrian people. What will happen after we even win this war against ISIS? What would we do then? Would we heed to the entire call for Bashar al-Assad's dismissal? That was something they never talked about in this debate. What did they talk about? They talked about that when war isn't fought on moral absolutes, it's fought on realpolitik. Well, we've seen that that is the exact logic used to prop up dictators like Hosni Mubarak, prop up other dictators. But has that worked out for you? No. Let's take their logic. Firstly, even if it's being fought on realpolitik, they needed to prove to us how they're actually going to win that war by supporting someone like Bashar al-Assad. And I'll be showing you later how a war against ISIS, which is especially a war of hearts and minds, cannot be fought in this particular way. But secondly, we also believe that you do have to take a moral stand. Why? Because in the past you supported actors that are not ideologically aligned towards you, and that is where the problem arises. So that is why groups like ISIS and Al-Nusra Front have risen in the first place, because of the undue support they enjoyed in the past. That is how the Egyptian Jihad, for example, stood up in Egypt. That is a problem that they need to address. But what else they talk about? They talk about that, well, there's no coherence in the war effort right now, so you need to unify against a specific actor. No, thank you, sir. Firstly, they needed to prove us why unify behind this specific actor, and as we're talking about, you can even unify behind other actors in the conflict as well. Because what do we believe? We believe that firstly, you should support what kind of organization? You should support, for example, the Peshmerga in Syria. How that's a community that has a right to self-defense, that cannot defend itself, and has shown an active will to fight against ISIS. Why? Because they are acting in self-defense and also are acting for the safety of their homeland. Why don't we believe that Bashar al-Assad argues? It was very funny because I was about to ask Nawal this very few. Why don't you support the Al-Nusra Front in Iraq? She said that, well, in her own speech, the Al-Nusra Front is a terrorist organization, and that's why we can't support them because the UN says so. So basically the differentiating factor between Bashar al-Assad and the Al-Nusra Front is that one has the flag of statehood above him and the other does not. We don't believe that is a differentiating factor. You need to take human rights violation as itself. In fact, if Bashar al-Assad uses chemical weapons, no thank you sir, sit down. If Bashar al-Assad uses chemical weapons, that is a worse violation than something the Al-Nusra Front has ever done in the past. So why are they not okay with funding the Al-Nusra Front against ISIS? But what else will we be talking about? Firstly, we believe the Syrian people will lose faith in the Western world. Right now you have this refugee crisis that Nawal talked about, how they're reaching out for the Western world for help. But the problem is, in a war like this, in which the enemy is inside the city, which infiltrates your active public space, the problem is that this is a war of hearts and minds, where you have to make a public narrative against extremism, something that ISIS espouses. But you're not doing that. When the Western world takes a stand with Bashar al-Assad, someone the common Syrian man wants to replace, someone who has hereditary power simply from his father Hafiz al-Assad, that is where the problem arises. Someone who uses chemical weapons. When you support that kind of person, someone who's pro-Alawi, who oppresses the Sunni majority inside Syria, that is where the problem arises. So thanks. And we also believe this gives in to ISIS's rhetoric. Because let's take it, we condemn what ISIS does, as we condemn what the Black Panthers did, for example, in the United States of America. But you get where they're coming from. Why? Because even then, what is ISIS's rhetoric? ISIS's rhetoric is that Bashar al-Assad has historically oppressed the Sunnis in Syria, and so when you prop up and support Bashar al-Assad, that is where the problem arises over there. That rhetoric is played into. No thank you, sir. But what else do they need to take into account? They need to take into account that, well, this kind of support for Bashar al-Assad is counterproductive. Why? Because let's even look at the regional concerns as well. We've already talked about how Bashar al-Assad is pro-Russian because he enjoys Russian support, how Russia has its only military base in the Middle East, based in Syria right now. Yes, sir.
What's more likely? Is it going to be more likely for Saudi Arabia or Iran to have a joint front to fight ISIS, or is it like something else in your mind?
Fine. Even if I concede that it's more likely, I'm not conceding, even if it's more likely that Bashar al-Assad will take up arms against ISIS, what will happen then? That is the problem of the government bench over here, the end game of the conflict. What will happen even after you eradicate ISIS? That is something you're not doing. Because Bashar al-Assad will remain a persistent problem for Syria, because how does he gain power? He gains power by oppressing the majority, by keeping the state structures to himself. How can the West, as a responsible community, support that kind of actor? That is something you needed to prove today. But let's look at the regional goals over here. We've already talked about Russia being Syria being pro-Russian. We don't think that relationship will be broken down by Western support in itself, because of the special historical relation that they enjoy. Firstly, secondly, the other regional actors that you need to look into, they also mentioned how Iran supports Syria. That's true. Another organization also supports Syria, actually supplies them arms and men. Is Hezbollah, is an organization that commits human rights violation in Lebanon, for example. And for example, when the Western community is aligned, for example, towards Israel, that is where the problem also arises in the end game as well. When you have a state that is pro-Russian and can be belligerent towards Israel as well. That is where another problem arises for the long term over here. So it becomes counterproductive to your regional goals as far as dealing with Iran and how mitigating that entire Middle Eastern conflict is concerned. But why is our policy different? Our policy of funding the Peshmerga, of funding these other organizations that have a more liberal outlook, because firstly, they're more ideologically aligned with you. In the past, the mistake you've made is that you've decided to align yourselves with actors, with organizations, no thank you sir, with organizations that are not even ideologically aligned with you, and that is where the problem arises. So when you support a dictator like Hosni Mubarak, when you support a dictator like Saddam Hussein, that is where the problems have arisen in the past. For example, when he supported the Shah of Iran as well. Over here, what we're concentrating on the side, and that is why we feel that we take this debate, is because this debate is not only happening in the vacuum of the Syrian conflict that's happening right here and right now. It's about the long-term solution of Syria, and we do not believe Bashar al-Assad has a place over there. Why? Because of his undemocratic nature, because of his history of oppressing people, and when you have to consider such things as well, we realize that the team government has done nothing to talk, even hasn't even mentioned the long-term implication, and that is why we take this debate.
That was Taha's.
Let me tell Qasim what the end game means. The end game means that the moment Bashar al-Assad happens to defeat ISIS and Syria protects its sovereignty, we deal with Bashar al-Assad at that point in time after he, as a state actor, someone who's been in power for a long time, someone who has experience of reconstruction, someone who's experience of running a state, has managed to get his state back together and has allowed for free and fair elections to take place. The same peace initiative by the United Nations that Bashar al-Assad has very recently said he supports, but only when the threat of ISIS has been taken down and that opposition forces and terrorists, which means the al-Nusra Front, have been taken out of commission within Syria. Bashar al-Assad is not a bad man. He lifted the hated emergency law from 1963. He allowed in 2001, immediately after his ascension, for political prisoners to be released. In 2011, he did the same. The problem was that when a dictator gives you leeway, and we concede that he's a dictator, and we'll get to that later, the moment you, as the Western government, intervene within that region and try and destabilize his forces by funding non-state actors, you're taking his reason for giving leeway away and democratizing Syria less and less legitimate. You're actually disincentivizing Bashar al-Assad from bringing in positive reform and change. The reason for why Bashar al-Assad has not been able to make Syria a more democratic place, even after he's completely dismissed his cabinet of loyalists who were there from the time of Hafiz al-Assad, who were actually inhibiting reform, is simply because they did not let him do that. And we think that's the problem. First reason, the end game resolved. We will let him reconstruct Syria. After that has been done, we'll let him hold free and fair elections, because Bashar al-Assad is also supported by large tracts of the Syrian population. And after having beaten the crap out of ISIS and after having gotten rid Syria of all of these forces, we think he's either going to win the election, or if not, the new government can do whatever it wants with him. That's not a concern, but this is the end game that we want you to understand. Beating ISIS and allowing for him to reconstruct Syria. This brings me to Qasim's rebuttal. Before that, sir, no. Saudi Arabia is not a very democratic state. Saudi Arabia has a hereditary dictatorship in place. It's called a monarchy, but it's still a dictatorship. They behead people all the time. They make a mockery out of human rights violations. The only thing that they haven't done that is different from Bashar al-Assad is carrying out chemical attacks, which, by the way, is still contentious. No one knows whether chemical attacks were used by the Bashar al-Assad regime, with there being evidence from the other side as well, that the opposition was responsible for this, right? We think that when Western governments make it their point to support such hereditary regimes and then take out the possibility of social change by supporting dictators in places like Bahrain, they have absolutely no moral culpability, they have absolutely no moral legitimacy to make the sort of arguments Qasim just did. Just because Bashar al-Assad has been a dictator is not a good enough reason to not support him. Remember Ngo Dinh Diem, South Vietnam, you supported him, a Catholic person who killed Buddhists left, right and center. Why? Because he was a strategic asset in the war against North Vietnam. You've been supporting dictators for hundreds of years. That's what empire building and colonialism has been built on. That's perfectly fine. The argument that he makes is that's acceptable. Why? Because the larger goal is the greater good of the Syrian people, which cannot be resolved until and unless ISIS has been beaten. With that argument dealt with, why is Bashar al-Assad the best actor to do this, right? And this is the critical question of this debate. Nawal gave you multiple lines of analysis for this. They went unrefuted. She said he's someone with governmental experience. He's someone who has familiarity value. He's someone who's fairly popular in Syria for the simple reason that when there were walks against him and protests against him, there were equally large protests in support of him and in favor of him. These are all great reasons for why he should be supported. Great reasons why he can unify the people of Syria behind him. But most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, he's more militarily capable than the opposition because he just beat the crap out of them in Aleppo, and he's more militarily capable when it comes to dealing with ISIS because he just took the city of Palmyra away from ISIS and established his own bit there. This is a man who has the support of Russia. This is the man who's militarily capable of doing this. Militarily being the key word here, and otherwise as a political option is also acceptable to us. More arguments than Nawal made. This guy is an internationally recognized actor. Unlike the Al-Nusra Front, who happen to be terrorists, who happen to be non-state actors, who cannot be bound by rules of engagement clearly laid down in international law, while the same cannot be said for Bashar al-Assad because he's clearly bound by them, because if he's not, then his supporters like Iran and Russia will look bad. So it is in their interest to make sure that he abides by the rules of conduct laid down in international law. These are the sort of entrenched guarantees that a non-state actor cannot be given because they're unpredictable. Case in point, your own Free Syrian Army, there's ample evidence for them using chemical weapons against their own lovely people of Syria. We can't trust them. We don't think they're good enough to trust. No. This brings me to the positive argumentation I have. We think that not allowing Bashar al-Assad is going to be a huge problem because you're giving in to the mindset of people like King Salman bin Abdulaziz and his crazy whoever is related to him, the guy who's going to become king next, right? There's a specific problem with that. The specific problem with that is that this man, the next guy who's very powerful because the king has dementia and who makes policies all the time because the king clearly is physically incapable to do so, is a greater hardliner than most monarchs in the history of Saudi Arabia, is out to sabotage the deal with Iran, wants to militarily attack Iran, uses aggressive rhetoric against Iran, and we think that one of the reasons for why Bashar al-Assad has not managed to even gain greater gains against ISIS in Syria is because of the Qatari and Saudi Arabian coalition and because of the harm they've caused right now. More importantly, the US coalition's airstrikes have empirically led to more Syrians joining the cause of ISIS because they think that the ISIS rhetoric is better served not by Syrians fighting ISIS but by the United States being involved. The United States themselves.
On that point,
and we think that ISIS has a greater reason to sell or market themselves because the bigger problem is not with Syrians. Of course, they're Shia, right? But the biggest problem is with the ideas of imperialism the United States sanctioned airstrikes are giving air to right now or endorsing right now. So if ISIS support happens to be a parameter, it happens to be a concern, it falls better on our side. The third reason why we want to talk to you about this is because there will be greater support within the United States of America to do this, right? And why do we say that? The politicians in the United States of America had a hardline stance regarding Bashar al-Assad. There was great debate within the United Nations Security Council about militarily intervening in Syria and destroying Syria for all that we know and taking out Bashar al-Assad by force. Remember, after Russia managed to obtain a veto in the United Nations Security Council against that policy, the United States has clearly softened its policy towards Syria. And we see that in the various various policy statements that come from the United States right now, right? So right now, Barack Obama has not ruled out the possibility of cooperating with native-bred forces, but he still thinks that the future would look better without Bashar al-Assad being there. Compare this rhetoric and compare this language with what used to be before. We think that this is really important because these trends show that not only is the United States of America moving towards a world in which this cooperation would be efficacious and possible, but also that in the process of doing so, it is going to invite support from the people of the United States of America, which is another extremely important stakeholder in this regard. What did we as opening up show? We showed you, ladies and gentlemen, that the greatest considerations that they had, the ideological problem with our principle does not apply because the United States and other Western forces have clearly not been consistent on that. We showed you why Bashar al-Assad is the best man compared to non-state actors. And we gave you two separate positive reasons, undermining Saudi Arabia as well as creating an environment more conducive towards supporting Bashar al-Assad within the United States of America. They are all compelling enough reasons for you to vote.
I heard about the speech and finally what better to call about
I'm going to be integrating positive material and rebuttal in this. I'm going to be taking my speech along three major issues. be following Namal's format. Number one, is it morally legitimate to support Assad? Number two, is he the most effective actor against ISIS? And number three, what's best for the Syrian people? Let's go right into the first one, this idea of whether or not he's a morally legitimate choice to make. Their first justification for this: states operate in a framework of realpolitik, you can't have ideological considerations. That's straight up a lie. Just because you operate in a framework of realpolitik doesn't mean that that realpolitik isn't guided by your ideological considerations. And we think that the whole idea of being a liberal democracy is that you have to act in the name of this liberalism. To assume that being a liberal democracy means you have to make cynical liberal interventions is unfair in the first place, because it is the duty of a liberal democracy to stick true to its values to the greatest degree possible. And if we can prove to you that there are other alternatives within the region besides Assad, then it's perfectly legitimate for us to support them. Which is where we have to point out that Hafiz's attacks on our alternative never actually tackled the body which we use to identify our alternative. We talked about the Peshmerga, we talked about democratic bodies in the region which were ideologically much more in line with the democracy we're talking about. We absolutely did not talk about the Free Syrian Army. That's not something which we stand for at all. There's a few things we're going to continue to talk about in this idea of moral legitimacy. First of all, we think Assad is a bad man, quite contrary to this claim that he is not a bad man. Hafiz might look at Assad with fatherly love, but the problem is that even if Assad does release political prisoners, he took political prisoners. Even if Assad may or may not have chemically bombed his people, he has oppressed them in a multitude of ways outside of that. There's a reason he's an unpopular ruler. It's an absolute lie for them to say Assad is a popular man in the region. You can only say that if you assume that everybody who joins ISIS because of Assad isn't a member of the Syrian population anymore. We think Assad is absolutely an unpopular man in Syria and only survives because of the consolidation of power he's created. Next, they told you, well, we've helped so many other dictators, why can't we do this one? Because multiple wrongs don't make a right. And even if for hundreds of years Americans have been intervening across the world, for hundreds of years people like us have been saying, please, no, don't do that, you're going to screw up the situation in the future, like you've done every time, like you're on the road to doing one more time. We told you a couple of things when it came to moral legitimacy as well. We told you about diplomatic two-facedness, basically how you're interacting with somebody and at the same time endangering every other foreign relation you have. People like Syria, people like Israel, who are going to feel threatened when you're interacting with bodies who are actively supported by the people who bomb Israel. But we heard no response on this side from Hafiz, which is problematic on their part. And lastly, this material Hafiz brought in, something how we're giving in to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Except that's not why we're doing this. We're doing this because Assad is a bad person, and whether or not the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia agrees with that is irrelevant. The messenger is irrelevant. The message is what's important, and since Hafiz told me run this argument not too long ago, I'm pretty sure he'll agree. So on no level is it morally legitimate to support Assad, especially since other parties exist in the region. Second idea, this idea of whether or not Assad is the most effective force against ISIS before that.
Under your model, you should actively disengage with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and all of these forces. Would you ever be able to help Peshmerga when all of these strategic allies have been actively disengaged?
Most likely yes, because airstrikes are still the biggest boom which America provides in this region. And this actually brings us right on to Assad's effectiveness against ISIS. They argue that because of his military capability and his ability to take back Palmyra, Assad is the most effective military actor in the region. The problem is, Assad's army is only so effective because of constant allied bombing in this region. The reason that his poor, weak, ill-equipped army is able to put up a fight at all against a much larger foe is because precisely Western airstrikes are happening. Therefore, if we redirect Western airstrikes to other belligerents in the region, what's to stop them from achieving parallel levels of success? We don't know. Additionally, there are other problems with Assad which many other fighters in this region don't face. First of all, Assad's army is in a state of constant defection. Large portions of this army have defected to the Free Syrian Army. This army is constantly dwindling and diminishing. The problem with it isn't even casualties as much as it is a lack of loyalty. Secondly, Assad's army is actively picking off other people in the region while fighting ISIS. On the behest of fighting ISIS, Assad's army is simultaneously attacking the Kurds, it's fighting the FSA. It's incapable of maintaining these many fronts. It's simply not the same effective fighting force it's being painted out to be. And the other justification they gave, you can identify behind Assad because he's familiar. Yes, he's very familiar. Everyone hates him. The community can just as easily rally behind somebody else, especially the Kurds, who are ideologically in line with you much more effectively and much more reasonably without the sort of identity crisis it creates when you start supporting a dictator. Additionally, this idea of ISIS recruitment we brought up, their response was, no, we actually hate the West a lot more than they hate Assad. We think that is simply untrue. The dynamics of Syrian politics are distinct because Assad is part of an elite Shiite minority which is oppressing the Sunni majority of the region. Anti-Assad rhetoric is literally what fuels these people right now. And if we can redirect this rhetoric, we deny ISIS a lot of the recruitment it's currently built on. Additionally, if we start powering the Kurds, if we start funding them, if we start aiding them, we give them the ability to become an active ideological alternative to joining ISIS.
Point, sir.
Because when you're alienated by the dominant state in your country, then you need to find a new home. And right now, the only viable home is ISIS. If we power the Kurds up, then their ideology, democracy, becomes a viable alternative within this region as well. And we'd be very happy if something like that happened. So we've proven on this level that
Point,
Assad
sir.
is not the only legitimate choice against ISIS, and that other choices lead to a more democratic outcome. I did take one. Sit down. Third idea. What's best for the Syrian people? And over here, basically, we have a few things to talk about again. Number one, we think that the Syrian people are going to feel fundamentally disillusioned with the West if the West continues to support Assad, because Assad has been continuously attacking the Syrian people. This was a line of analysis again brought to you by Qasim, again dropped by Hafiz, the idea of the long-term relationship between Syria and the West. Second, we tell you, and this is in response to what Hafiz supported his speech with, we're going to open his speech, we're going to deal with Assad after. You can't deal with Assad after. Because the problem is that during this wartime, Assad will be capable of doing two things. One, because of the lack of transparency in Syria, he's going to be able to deal with any forms of political opposition which exist, whether they be military or whether they be within his own state. Two, he's going to continue to centralize power within himself, following the same structures he's been following for a very long time since his father. This is also a dictatorship, ladies and gentlemen. He's going to continue following these. He's going to centralize power, and he's going to become impossible to dislodge. We have precedent for this when we look at Saddam Hussein. Americans hated him initially, then they couldn't dislodge him simply later on because he'd grown belligerent. He's not going to compromise. He's going to claim he's going to compromise, but there is no reason for him to compromise because there is no power which the West holds over him, because there is no transparency to show you whether or not there's anything going on there actively illegal. And again, this idea that Assad doesn't wear the pants in this relationship is completely wrong, because the West's objective here is to fight ISIS. If you've identified Assad as the only legitimate choice against ISIS, then Assad is going to receive almost unconditional support from the West. It would make no sense to cut it off if he started acting illiberally. Their case is contradictory on that level. Lastly, we also think that one other benefit is achieved here, which is that you correct the balance which has existed in Syria by removing Assad's power, by empowering other forces. So in the end, ladies and gentlemen, Assad is not a morally legitimate option. He's not the best option to fight ISIS, and if you want a better Syria for the Syrian people, you have to stand with opening opposition.
I think
Regulatory force for time method?
Mera use kar lo. This might turn off, so just like keep pressing it randomly.
The opening opposition brings you two really weird alternatives in terms of backing someone that's not Bashar Assad. Their first alternative, let's back the Kurdish Peshmerga. You know where it's operating? It's operating towards the eastern end of the conflict, something that's not even near the territories where the Free Syrian Army or Syria is operating against them. We don't think an actor that is millions of miles, thousands of miles away from a geographical area can ever be a viable alternative to Bashar Assad. Let's remove that from the picture. But even if, say, the Kurds were operating, the reason why, if anything, that strengthens the government's argument is because the Kurds operate like a state. The Kurds operate like a mechanism, like a proper functioning army. The area of Kurdistan that is near Iraq, ladies and gentlemen, has a legitimate functioning government that functions along the lines of a state apparatus. It has a functioning army that recruits and provides mechanisms where it is held accountable if it does commit war crimes, for example. So we do think all of that criteria is not is something that Bashar al-Assad as part of the Syrian state also follows. No, thank you, sir. The second alternative they had, which we think is ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen. This alternative was about how we should back people like the Free Syrian Army. And the reason why we think that's absolutely ridiculous is because number one, we don't think the Free Syrian Army is a homogeneous group that you can treat like something like that. Because we need to understand that the Free Syrian Army is a label for an umbrella organization that controls a large degree of splinter cells in the area and splinter militant groups. The reason why you can't engage with a splinter militant group like the Free Syrian Army, so thank you Kaha, over here, is because when you understand that weapons that fall into the hands of non-state actors like ISIS, the reason why ISIS became so strong in the first place because you didn't have accountability mechanisms when you distributed weapons and artillery in areas like Syria, when you backed and financed the Free Syrian Army against the al-Assad regime. We don't trust them, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to fighting over here. No, thank you, sir. And then with this entire analysis about how they ignored openings attack about how you're aligning yourself with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Qatar. When they find it so when they find it so morally culpable to engage with a dictator, we ask them about this hypocrisy. You can't have it both ways, ladies and gentlemen. Either you cut yourself away from engaging with regimes like Iran, or you cut yourself away from engaging with regimes like Saudi Arabia. If you are talking about simply on the metric of human rights record, the reason why you should separate yourself away from engaging into any economic alliances with Saudi Arabia, because you need to understand at the end of the day, there's a harsh reality. You need to trade with them and you need to form military alliances with them. You may not agree with everything they do at the end of the day. We think opening opposition is being extremely ignorant as far as that goes. Moving on no, thank you, sir. And then they talk about how Assad is somehow in some way analogous to Saddam Hussein. The difference between Saddam Hussein and Bashar al-Assad at this point in time, ladies and gentlemen, is that the very existence of Saddam Hussein was not threatened at the time of the Gulf War. You didn't have an enemy the size of ISIS over here that was ready to consume it at its very will. And if there's an example that it works in our favor, it's that of Ziaul Haq. Ziaul Haq is someone who spewed anti-American rhetoric in the early days of his regime. And the reason why he pandered in and gave in to agree with them, because he saw the face of the export of communism at its very borders. And we think that's how a dictator operates when he has to agree with it. No, thank you, sir. Moving on to my substantive issue. I'll take the talk.
Where was the bit where Ziaul Haq became liberal and tolerant and introduced democratic reform?
It was a necessary move in order to counter communism, ladies and gentlemen. We think and we think that's how you operate when it comes to foreign policy and wars. Back to my substantive. Why we think it's imperative to coordinate. As what are the fronts on which the war is being fought on, ladies and gentlemen? We think there are two main fronts. There's one front where Iran and Saudi Arabia are not ever possibly going to reconcile, and they're fighting on two uncoordinated fronts as far as the East goes, ladies and gentlemen. We need to understand that's something that can never ever be reconciled. But as far as the West goes, we think there's a greater likelihood for the West to converge and work with Syria and Russia as far as countering the threat towards the western side of this coast. And why is it more important on the western part? Because there are two problems that are distinct to this region. Number one, we think that the Bashar al-Assad state is forced into working with ISIS when it's not giving support right now. For example, they buy oil from them because they're forced out of having no support from the West. They don't do it because they really want to, Hassan. The reason why they engage with some sort of relations with them is because they're not given any backing by the West as far as that goes. And if you aren't talking about, no thank you sir, stop badgering me, if you aren't talking about how you're going to cut down lines of oil and trace the economic crimes that form the backbone of ISIS over here, ladies and gentlemen, is when you back a legitimate government that has the capacity to police the streets better than say something like the Free Syrian Army. We agree it's not the best choice over here, but again, it's a better choice. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, about why we think it's better as far as dispensing things like humanitarian aid over there, ladies and gentlemen. Because one way you have the Kurdish Peshmerga that has some sort of agency when it comes to governance, and you have the Iraqi government that has dispensing mechanisms when it comes to dispensing aid. You don't have something on the Western Front when it comes to the conflict in Syria over here, ladies and gentlemen. The Free Syrian Army and these umbrella militant groups don't have the capacity to allow and engage groups like the Red Cross to work with them in these areas, ladies and gentlemen. The reason why we think that even if a state is evil and you must agree with them in order to dispense these things, because we think there are vulnerable children over there at this point in time, ladies and gentlemen, that need to receive these services from the West. And these things are very, very important. Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, and why we think it's very important as far as governance goes. We think and we'll extend opening analysis about why ISIS proves to be some sort of a better alternative to the Syrian state over there. We tell you today when people go towards the ISIS lands in search of, say, why better governance takes place over there. Let's put it aside. We hold Bashar al-Assad accountable for his crimes against democracy at a later date. But when it comes to simply protecting its people from, say, the writ of ISIS, we think it's important to back a government and make sure that people don't end up outside of those territories. It's the West's duty to ensure that responsible governance takes place on that end, and we think they'll be facilitating that as far as this goes. What have I shown to you across the duration of my speech? One, I've shown you there's no other viable alternative other than engaging with Assad, because we don't think the Free Syrian Army can ever be held accountable according to the same metric. We don't think the Al-Nusra Front or the Kurdish Peshmerga, even with the geographical proximity of that area. And I've also shown you why it's important to counter ISIS as far as economic crimes goes, and you can only do that if you engage meaningfully with Bashar al-Assad. For all these reasons, I'm extremely proud of performance.
Alright, I thank John for that speech, and to further the case of the opposite trend, we'll call on
There are three things that I'm going to do for you today. And after that, a lot is going to be left for Abbas to report. The first thing, so you must listen closely. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is the importance of values and why the West needs to be more consistent in its proclamation of certain values. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the danger of Assad's government. And the third thing I'm going to talk about is why it's necessary to take a stronger stance against Bashar al-Assad. So the first thing, ladies and gentlemen, about values. What we came up here and told you was that the West continuously wages wars of values. The way they talk about the rhetoric of fighting the war on terror, because it is a war of values. These terrorists and these people go against certain values that we hold dear. Values such as modernity, values such as the right to life, values such as the quality of life, and values such as giving the people freedom. And that is the reason why these people fought wars in the first place. But in this case, they shortchange it. Why? Because it's just not convenient. We don't think, ladies and gentlemen, that we want to build a type of government that is able to go to war based on its own whims. There must be some system of accountability that every government is tied to. What Hafiz will have you say is that, well, if you were consistently bad in the past, thus it is necessary for you to also follow those consistencies now. But that is exactly the type of government that we want to protect. A government that is aligned with certain values. A government that does not prop up dictators left, right and center that end up oppressing its people. But a government that is aligned to certain values, ladies and gentlemen, that it does not fall short of when the circumstances change. And that is where we need greater consistency. Sit down. But there was a difference that they wanted to create. They said that, well, ISIS are terrorists and Bashar al-Assad is not a terrorist. This is what the closing half is going to contest. Bashar al-Assad has killed more people than ISIS has done in the past, ladies and gentlemen. And that is why we perhaps think he's a greater terrorist. And this is where our values become very important. Because if you support Bashar al-Assad by hook or by crook, you are being an accessory to the suffering of the people, because you are emboldening a regime that works against the wills of these people. And that is not something that we want to do. Sit down. Then they also talk about, well, just because you did wrong in the past, ladies and gentlemen, does not necessitate that you consistently also do wrong now. So just because you built Abu Ghraib, by natural extension, does not mean that you can also build Guantanamo Bay now, ladies and gentlemen. What that means is that the first instance of oppression should not have occurred, not that you should carry on further oppression just because you oppressed in the past. And this is where Jami was a little different, but not really. He gave the example of Saudi Arabia, that, well, you need to benefit. But if your benefit comes at the cost of people losing their life, we don't think that we need to stand for those benefits, ladies and gentlemen, because that is exactly the self-centered view of a government that you want to propagate in the international arena. These things and these inflammatory language of how this is, real politics and hence everything is justified is what causes oppression. And there needs to be a move away from this idea of how the real politic permits everything as long as instances are aligned, ladies and gentlemen, because that does not prompt governments to be responsible. And we as Team Closing Half want governments to be more responsible. Then he also gave the example of Ziaul Haq, and, well, you supported him because you needed to end the threat of communism. We don't think that he was able to lift up the threat of communism, ladies and gentlemen. It's just another system. So he wasn't able to justify why you had to support Ziaul Haq in that case. But what was the consequence of supporting Ziaul Haq? The consequence of supporting Ziaul Haq, a dictator who by his own mindset wanted to oppress the people, was that, well, he went on to formulate the Mujahideen force. And that is exactly what such dictatorships do, ladies and gentlemen, when they are not challenged and when they are not questioned. Sit down.
Point, sir.
But they also continuously assume in this debate that Bashar Assad has a lot to contribute, and that has been the running theme throughout this debate. Now, the closing half wants to contest this very strongly. Number one, Bashar Assad is continuously losing land, which means that he has already lost control of the majority area within Syria, ladies and gentlemen, which means that Bashar Assad is not as strong as you paint him to be. Number two, he is losing the support of the people. Thus, he is not as strong as you paint him to be, ladies and gentlemen. The only thing that you say is, well, he has a state apparatus, ladies and gentlemen, and he has a certain regime. We don't think that that necessarily means in a state of civil war that you are more powerful, because in a civil war, even if you control the state, oftentimes you can be overthrown. So just control and the assumption of power does not necessarily mean that you're as strong as you make yourself out to be. Sit down. Then we also talk about, ladies and gentlemen, why it's necessary to take a strong stance against Bashar al-Assad. Because the first thing that we ask them is, will they let the lives of the people who've been lost when it came to chemical bombing go in vain? What will be their view of accountability, ladies and gentlemen? They say, Hafiz clearly said that we will hold him accountable after the war. But you understand, after the war against ISIS has been fought, Bashar al-Assad will be so strong that the endpoint that you have highlighted of greater accountability won't be met. That is, no, it's not a concession. Sit down. What we're saying is that he won't be held accountable, ladies and gentlemen. Something that we believe that he should be held accountable for. Sit down and don't badger. Sit down. You asked your POI, by the way. Alright, so we also told you how the soft stance in the previous time did not work. When we told you that when you stopped him from having chemical bombing, something that he did, by the way, it's set in stone that he has killed people, he went on to use biological weapons. Thus, Bashar Assad being contained through our support has also used that support as a sign of his own account, as a sign of his own prestige and a sign of his own legitimacy. Thus, he continuously confuses the fact that he is being given support as a sign of legitimacy and uses that against his own people. And that is exactly what we as team opposition want to prevent. So another thing, ladies and gentlemen, this team then becomes, after having promoted that this is not in line with our values and Bashar Assad does not have a lot to give, let's understand which side at the end helps the war effort. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is how this weakens the fight against ISIS. Now, why does this weaken the fight against ISIS? ISIS continuously uses the fact that, well, they're in a state of civil war, the fact that Bashar al-Assad's government being in power as a way of getting more recruitment, ladies and gentlemen. So Bashar al-Assad's absence will mean that a cause of recruitment has gone down the drain. Another thing, ladies and gentlemen, it is in the interest of Bashar al-Assad to perpetuate the civil war, ladies and gentlemen, because as long as there is a civil war, he remains powerful because he benefits because of the civil war, ladies and gentlemen. That is the only thing that is keeping him in power. Thus, he does not necessarily have a strong need to fight against this. Then we also told you how he is not necessarily also fighting the ISIS. Most of the attacks that he has done is against the Free Syrian Army and not against ISIS, ladies and gentlemen. So we believe that you have conveniently lied in this debate. Then we also told you, ladies and gentlemen, that the fourth thing, there is the Kurdish Peshmerga and there is the FSA. These people have been stronger in their fight against ISIS. Why? Because Bashar al-Assad wants his power to be there. But what these people want is they're inclined towards a more loyalist cause of claiming their own country back. And thus they are more loyal towards the cause, something that you have also not understood. And another idea, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that in your model, people fight up against the United States of America more. Why? Because there is hypocrisy that is seen in the actions of the United States of America. Number one, they're fighting ISIS, and that already prompts recruitment. We understand that. Don't be smart and say, oh, well, recruitment will already happen because you're fighting the ISIS. But there will be more recruitment. Why? Because it's also now supporting a dictator, ladies and gentlemen, which is not consistent with their values. Thus, a more demonic image of the United States of America is being painted. At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, we think that you must have an inclination to promote your own values. We also think, ladies and gentlemen, the proposition has not sufficiently shown how they're helping the war effort. For all those reasons, our opposition.
Alright, thank you for that speech and all the fun about it. That's the case for the government.
It's funny how Azim told me that I have a lot to refute after he sits down. But trustingly enough, he never refuted the extension Jami gave me. When Jami came up here and talking about oil trade that Syria carries out with ISIS, when he talking about oil trade that ISIS carries out with Turkey, ladies and gentlemen, we think that's a problem. And we think because these are ways of revenue, ways through which ISIS can gain revenue, ladies and gentlemen, we think we need to stop it. Who is in a better position to stop it? Bashar Assad or non-state actors, ladies and gentlemen? We think the former. Primarily because we think that there is geographical familiarity. Bashar Assad has geographical familiarity, and by virtue of that, because he has more resources, something which I'll talk to you about later, we think he's in a better position to deal with it. Secondly, we then talk to you about how Assad is in a much better position and the state is in a much better position to dispense humanitarian aid as opposed to non-state actors. We don't think that these lines of extension were ever once challenged by Aziz. But let's move on to what he said and what the opposition bench here as a whole said. So the structure of my speech is going to be simple. What I'm going to do is show you why supporting Bashar al-Assad is better as opposed to supporting non-state actors such as Peshmerga, such as the Free Syrian Army, right? They would have you believe that we should support Bashar al-Assad because he espouses values that are not in line with the values that the Western nations espouse. Like killing its own people, right? Like human rights violations. Let's understand this. If we support Bashar al-Assad against ISIS, does that necessarily mean that we support every single action that Bashar al-Assad carries out? We don't think so, ladies and gentlemen. If Bashar al-Assad goes ahead and kills people in Syria, ladies and gentlemen, that doesn't necessarily mean that by supporting him in the war against ISIS, you support that as well. We don't think that's true. Interestingly enough, we think international relations, there are no such thing as permanent friends. We need to understand that alliances are made and alliances are broken. And they're of intrastate.
On that point.
No, thank you. We need to understand that these alliances are important. And alliances are very circumstantial and situational, right? When you see that ISIS is a very big threat, when you see that you have to curb down the threat of ISIS, not only because of the refugee problem, but also because ISIS is a big threat, it's an international terrorist organization, it can easily make ways, no, thank you. It can easily make inroads into other countries or even in the United States of America. That is why these Western nations have responsibility to end it and by consequence support Bashar al-Assad. Azim would then have you believe that Bashar al-Assad is in a weak position. Why? Because he's losing land. If we tell you that's a lie, he just got back Aleppo. And interestingly enough, they come up here and say that, well, you know what? If you support Bashar al-Assad, what will end up happening is that he will become very, very powerful. When the entire conflict ends, he will stay in power. If you concede that by supporting Bashar al-Assad, you will make him stronger, then you automatically concede because he's stronger, you will be able to deal with ISIS, ladies and gentlemen. So we don't think their response really makes sense. The next thing Azim had to say was that, well, Bashar al-Assad is losing support of the people. Which brings me on to a very interesting question. Who has more support? Bashar al-Assad or these groups? I don't know, right? But let's understand. That Bashar, there's no way to ascertain that, right? You don't have, the only way to ascertain that is through a referendum. But you can't really gauge that. So how do you do so? The basic litmus test that we have is that he is in government. He's the head of state. He has represented, no thank you. He's the head of state. He's represented Syria in a lot of places. He was even voted for in the election that happened, ladies and gentlemen. Let's understand at the end of the day that who are you trying to support? Random people, literally random people, non-state actors who have, I don't even know how you can call, how you can think that they're representative. What is the yardstick in which you gauge if these groups are more representative or not? We don't think so. Because at the end of the day, and this is why I deal with this on two things. Number one, I talked to you about accountability. And number two, I talked about efficiency. On this accountability issue, opposition would have you talk about endpoints, right? They really like endpoints. The problem is, if you don't understand what is our endpoint with Bashar al-Assad, what is the guarantee that the endpoint you want to reach will be reached once you fund Peshmerga, will be reached once you support the FSA legion? And we tell you it really won't. And we tell you that Peshmerga, for example, is really geographically distant from, number one, is geographically distant from Syria, firstly. Secondly, we think it's in Iraq, right? So we don't think, and interestingly enough, what will happen if you give support to it, right? And according to their own logic, once you give support to a group, it will become very, very powerful, which you can't take down, right? Then why is Peshmerga or FSA the representative of the aspirations and the wishes of the Syrian people who you would have put into power? We don't think they can even know. You don't even know where they came up with such an absurd claim. The next thing, we told you about weaponizing non-state actors, right? And we told you what's very problematic. Because the point at which you weaponize non-state actors was the point at which you are ISIS. We don't think that it's important, we don't think that's a very wise strategy. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, when you went ahead and supported the M19, it initially had very altruistic intentions, right? But later it killed a lot of people. We don't think that's a very good way to go about things, right? Let's talk to you about resources. Let's talk about resources and who's in a much better position to deal with the threat of ISIS. Let's talk about Bashar al-Assad. Let's understand that Bashar al-Assad at this point in time, and let's do comparative analysis. Bashar al-Assad at this point in time has the support of state apparatus, right? He's going to have greater expertise because he's been within the region for a very long time, the government has, and consequently the state has, right? So it's better dealing with these places and finding out where the hideouts are, where the sanctuaries are, he's in a much better position. Second, he has more financial resources. as opposed to these non-state actors whom we don't even know where they get their financial resources from. At least we know that he gets loads and loads of money through taxes, right? Which is a lot of money. And we think that he's in a better position to deal, no thanks. We think he's in a much better position to deal with this threat. Let's talk to you about the FSA and Al-Nusra Front. But if openly, time and time again, we just recently, by the way, have stated that they're short of weapons, especially the A7 bombs, ladies and gentlemen, and the resources of that are depleted. We don't think they're at this point in time in a better position to deal with the threat. And why do we think that Bashar Assad will not like backstab us, right? Primarily because of one sense thing. We think that the agreement that's going to be there, if you support Bashar Assad, we think it's a mutually beneficial agreement. I'll tell you why. Because we think that Bashar Assad is in a stage, it's in a point where not only his past, but his life is at stake. The United States of America and other Western powers are at a point where ISIS is a threat, where the refugees could be a very big problem, right? And we think that's problematic. Because Bashar Assad needs something as well. He needs power at this point in time, he needs his life. We don't think that Bashar Assad will backstab us. That's first. Second, we think once the bigger problem is done, once ISIS, whom you can't trust whatsoever, as opposed to a government that is still, irrespective of whatever you want to call it, still a government, institutionalized government, right? As opposed to a non-state actor, as opposed to a non-state group such as ISIS that's going to go rampant and kill people, right? We think that your safe bet is with Bashar Assad. For all these reasons, you can
ठीक है
हाँ बस थैंक यू
नो प्रॉब्लम
the Nazi regime in Germany, the apartheid regime, the North Korean regime, Robert Mugabe. These are all examples of legitimate government regimes that side proposition would in a theoretical model be completely okay with supporting. Why? Just because they are governments and are legitimate. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that is what the problem with them is. Because they think that human rights are not universal, state systems are. Because they think that protecting the lives of individuals is not important, protecting people who have legitimate, somehow constructed state systems with them is better. And that's why we think, ladies and gentlemen, there's a fundamental moral difference between their side and ours. I'll be addressing three questions in my debate. Firstly, is there really a difference between Assad and ISIS? Secondly, the moral legitimacy of the alternative. And lastly, which solution is actually going to help both Syria and these Western governments, a term we think has been largely ignored and has been attributed to the US. The West is not just the US. Let's talk about the first question first. Is there a difference between Assad and ISIS? You need to understand, ladies and gentlemen, that they have been talking about this on two aspects. Firstly, in terms of genocide, they said, a lot of people have been killed. Yes, we realize. And Abbas very convenient said, we don't know who has killed more people. Exactly. If you don't know who has killed more people, ISIS and Assad, then how can you justify on a state level supporting an actor like Assad? We think, if anything, it blurs the distinction between them, meaning that you have to fight both of them and not one and choose and pick one over the other. That's the first level. The second level, the nature of the death that one person has been causing. We think, ladies and gentlemen, if anything, the nature of death that Bashar al-Assad has been giving his people is far more horrendous. Because not only has been using chemical and biological weapons, which by the way, ISIS is not even accused of using up till now. We think what he's also been doing is not just for 5 years, not just for 10 years, but for 40 years through a hereditary dictatorship, been taking away the quality of life of citizens, the ability to express themselves, the ability to come into government, the ability to question the government. So if we think you're talking about the nature of rights and the right to life being taken away, Assad has been far worse than them. And that is a fundamental premise that the government bench stands for us. They set the premise that because ISIS is worse than Assad, we should side with Assad. We don't agree with that premise because we think they are equally bad and need to be fought equally, not one over the other, not pick one over the other, because both of them compromise on fundamental Western principles that you talk about. Let's move on to the second idea, this idea of moral legitimacy. And here they talked about three things. The first thing they talked about to us was, because you're not being morally consistent, you should not do this. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, all the examples they've been giving us are examples from 30, 40 years ago. That's exactly what we're telling you. Not siding with Assad in present day times is learning from those examples. Examples of Vietnam, examples of Saddam Hussein, examples of the Mujahideen. Siding with bodies that we thought were lesser evils in order to have some kind of benefit is not an approach we should be taking. We think the approach that you should rather be taking is an approach where you talk about principles and values. So bodies that are more in line with Western principles and values get the preference, not bodies which are state actors or legitimate actors according to that definition of yours. Secondly, they said
it's convenient and strategically accessible, which is why we align with Assad. We think this is not even a moral argument. This is a practical idea that you're talking about. So essentially, they did not morally justify aligning with Assad in any way or form. All they said was because it will be beneficial for us, we should do it. We think, ladies and gentlemen, Western, when you talk about foreign policy tools and steps, they're always taken with the moral calculation in mind. The reason why you think nuclear weapons are bad than all other kinds of weapons is not just because of the number of people they kill. It's because of the way they kill the people, the humane aspect of it that is taken away. And we think they've been shying away from the moral aspect of this debate because they've not talked about why it's morally legitimate to side with Assad, aside by giving us state structures.
Hassan.
On the other hand, we also think they've been not talking about our principles and our ideas of moral legitimacy. Ideas like accountability, ideas like representation, ideas like democracy, ideas like giving the people a fair chance. You need to realize when you're siding with Assad, you're not just siding with the regime, you're siding with the structure and mindset of a dictatorship. What you're saying is it is legitimate for one person to stay in power for 15, 20, 30 years and we don't care as long as you serve our purpose. The problem with that, ladies and gentlemen, is that even if ISIS goes away, what you're doing basically is you're cementing this idea of a dictatorship because you don't care about the Syrian people and their quality and their life and conditions. You only care about their physical existence, and that is why we think this is a fundamental problem. Having dealt with that, now let's move on to the last idea, the solution, the short term and long term. No clarification for this time. The first idea they talked to us about was Assad has land. We told you, firstly, the only reason why ISIS is there in the first place is because Assad allowed it to come up. Why did Assad allow it to come up? Because we think this deflects attention from the issue of Assad. And the only reason why Assad needs your help right now is, the only reason we were helping Assad is because of ISIS. So in the natural calculation of a dictator, it is not in his natural incentives to take out ISIS because as soon as ISIS is taken out, the attention turns back to Assad. So we think their solution on a practical level will not be successful because it goes against the natural calculations that dictator has to make. On a second level, they said Assad has an army and Assad has local intel. Firstly, his army has been deflecting to the FSA, to the Al-Nusra front. Why? Because armies of dictators are not based on any loyalties and alliances, they're simply based on power. So as soon as Assad loses his power, they go away. We think, however, on the other armies like the FSA, who have been fighting long before ISIS came up, who have been fighting long before this issue even became a problem, are more in line with ideologies which we think they're better. Thirdly, they talk about this idea of structure and about rebuilding. We think, what structure are you talking about? When has Assad ever rebuilt Syria in the first place? When has any dictator rebuilt any country with the intention of actually helping the people? We also think, ladies and gentlemen, that Assad is not bound by rules. If Assad was bound by rules, when you banned him from using chemical weapons, he would not have resorted to using biological weapons. Showing to you that when an ally like Russia supports Assad, you don't hold him accountable, you give him leeway for committing even more acts of violence that they are supporting. Having dealt with all of that, now let's move on to the last practical idea, which is what we will talk about.
For that,
we also think, yes.
did your opening not clearly preclude FSA from the parameters of this debate and said that they were only going to argue for Peshmerga and not the other?
They thought it was a viable alternative in a space of alternatives. As posing our job is to talk about other alternatives that we also think are viable. Let's move on to our ideas. Firstly, we talked about recruitment. We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that recruitment is based on the idea who you support and who you don't support. So when the West starts supporting Assad, the people of Syria and the people who are living within other dictatorships don't side with the West. They go against the Assad. That's how you weaken the fight against ISIS, because you're giving him more of a recruitment plea, because now the recruitment is not just against the West, it's also against Assad. We told you at second level, ladies and gentlemen, that you're benefiting a structure, and any and every person living within the region that is against the structure of a dictatorship automatically aligns itself against the West because you're supporting a dictatorial structure. We told you at third level, ladies and gentlemen, that this is against ideas, this is against Western governments and their ideas. How? Because you need to realize, ladies and gentlemen, Western governments are not just the US, are not just the UK. We're also talking about countries like France, we're also talking about countries like Belgium. The only reason why attacks against these countries have been happening is because they are making bad moral choices like the US has been making. When you allow all Western governments to make this bad moral choice, you will have more Brussels attacks, you will have more Paris attacks. Not because you're fighting the ISIS, but because you're not taking down a moral evil in Assad. For the simple fact, ladies and gentlemen, that fighting one evil is not mutually exclusive to fighting the other. Vote closing opposition.